The Mafia boss was tied beside train tracks until a poor nurse and her daughter rushed to save him. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. It was a bright and sunny afternoon in the small town of Millbrook, but for some, the day was about to take a dangerous turn. On the outskirts of the town, a towering figure, bound and helpless, lay tied to the train tracks. His name was Victor Maloney, the infamous Mafia boss who ruled over the criminal underworld with an iron fist. Known for his cold, ruthless demeanor, Victor had made countless enemies throughout the years. But today, it wasn't one of his enemies who sought revenge. It was a plan meticulously orchestrated by people close to him. As the sound of an approaching train grew louder, the ropes around his wrists bit into his skin. Victor had never imagined this would be the end for him, not by a simple trap set by his own people. In the distance, a woman, hurrying along the path toward the tracks, was about to witness something that would change her life forever. Sarah Thompson, a nurse who lived just a few miles away with her daughter Emily, was finishing her shift at the local clinic when she decided to take a shortcut through the woods. She hadn't intended to find herself walking along the train tracks, but the path was quiet, peaceful, and she was eager to get home. Emily, her 8-year-old daughter, was with her, skipping along ahead as they made their way through the trees. Sarah smiled at the sight of her daughter's carefree joy, but that smile quickly faded when she heard the distant sound of the train's horn. She stopped in her tracks, her heart suddenly racing. There, just ahead, lying motionless and bound, was a man she recognized, Victor Maloney. Sarah's eyes widened in shock. She had heard of the Mafia boss, of course, but she never imagined she would find him like this. His face was bruised, and his eyes were barely open, as if he were already too weak to fight back. The train was coming, and it was coming fast. Without thinking, Sarah grabbed Emily's hand and rushed toward the tracks. She had no idea how, but she knew that she couldn't just stand there and let the man die, even if he was a Mafia boss. Her heart was racing in her chest, but she had no time to think about who he was or what he had done. She just knew that a life was in danger. Emily, her daughter, was too young to understand the gravity of the situation, but she could feel the tension in the air. She clung to her mother's side as Sarah moved faster, running alongside the tracks, trying to find a way to free Victor before it was too late. The train's horn grew louder, and Sarah could see the massive locomotive barreling down the tracks. The sound of the engine was deafening, and she knew they didn't have much time. Sweat beaded on Sarah's forehead as she frantically searched for a way to untie the ropes. She was no stranger to difficult situations, but this was unlike anything she had ever faced. The knots were tight, and the clock was ticking. Sarah could hear the rumble of the train's wheels growing closer, and she knew they had seconds, not minutes, to save him. With one last tug, the rope snapped free. Sarah pulled Victor to his feet just as the train came into view, the blinding lights of the locomotive reflecting in her eyes. She pushed him toward the side of the tracks, away from the speeding train, and with a final, desperate lunge, the two of them tumbled off the edge, just inches from disaster. The train passed by them with a deafening roar, the wind from its passing almost knocking Sarah and Victor to the ground. For a moment, everything was silent, and then, as she looked down at the man she had just saved, she felt a mix of disbelief and exhaustion wash over her. He was alive, but what now? As Sarah Thompson lay there on the ground, her breathing ragged and her heart still racing from the near miss with the train, she glanced over at Victor Maloney, the Mafia boss she had just saved. His dark eyes were open now, and he stared at her with a mix of confusion and disbelief. He wasn't sure what had just happened, but one thing was certain. His life had just been spared by a woman who had no reason to care about him. He was a man who had enemies, many of them. Yet, here she was, a simple nurse, saving him from certain death. He couldn't quite grasp why she had risked everything for him, a man with blood on his hands. Sarah, on the other hand, was still processing everything. Her instincts had taken over when she saw the train coming, and she had acted without hesitation. But now, As the adrenaline began to fade, reality started to sink in. She had just saved a mafia boss, a man whose name carried weight in the criminal world. What would he do now? Would he thank her, or was he going to see her as just another pawn in his world of power and control? She helped him sit up slowly, her hands shaking from the intensity of the moment. His voice was hoarse as he finally spoke, his words cutting through the silence. "Why did you help me?" he asked, his gaze unwavering. Sarah hesitated for a moment, trying to gather her thoughts. "I couldn't just let you die," she said softly. "No one deserves to die like that." Victor's lips curled into a half-smile, though it was tinged with irony. "You don't know who I am, do you?" he asked. Sarah looked into his eyes and nodded. "I know enough," she replied. "You're a man who needs saving." There was a long pause, and then Victor laughed, but it wasn't a laugh of humor. It was dark, heavy with years of pain and regret. "I've never needed saving," he said, shaking his head. "People like me don't get saved." "Maybe that's why you're still here," Sarah replied, her voice firm but kind. "Because someone was willing to save you, even if you didn't believe you deserved it." The words hung in the air between them, and for the first time, Victor felt a flicker of something inside him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Was it hope? Maybe. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but the fact that a woman like Sarah, someone with so little compared to him, had stepped in to save him, made him reconsider everything he had ever believed. Sarah helped him stand, though it took both of them a moment to find their balance. "We need to get you somewhere safe," she said, her voice still steady. "We'll find shelter and figure out what to do next." As they walked slowly toward the edge of the tracks, Sarah's mind raced. She couldn't help but wonder what would come next. She had saved Victor, yes, but what would that mean for her and her daughter, Emily? Would she be dragged into a world she wanted nothing to do with? Or was this the beginning of something else entirely? Something that would change her life forever? Victor didn't speak for a while, but his thoughts were as turbulent as Sarah's. His life had always been one of power, violence, and control. He had built his empire from the ground up, stepping on anyone who got in his way. But now, after being saved by a woman who had nothing to gain, he found himself questioning his choices. He had been so used to being the one who controlled everything, but Sarah had taken control in a way that made him feel powerless, and for the first time, he didn't mind. "I don't know what to say," he finally muttered, his voice quiet but sincere. Sarah turned to look at him, her face softening. "You don't have to say anything," she replied. "Just know that your life has value, whether you see it or not." The words hung in the air, and Victor felt a pang in his chest. Was it possible that this simple nurse, with nothing more than compassion and a willingness to act, had shown him something he had been missing all his life? As they reached a small, abandoned cabin a few miles down the road, Sarah helped him inside, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to breathe. It wasn't over, but for the moment, they were safe. Sarah's daughter, Emily, would be home soon, and she would have questions. Questions that Sarah wasn't sure how to answer. But one thing was certain. Her life had just collided with Victor Maloney's in a way she never could have predicted, and it would never be the same again. Sarah had settled Victor Maloney into the small, run-down cabin at the edge of the woods, her heart still racing from the events of the day. She glanced out the window nervously, her thoughts heavy with concern. She had saved a mafia boss, an infamous man with power and connections she could barely comprehend, and now she had no idea what to expect. Her daughter, Emily, would be home soon, and Sarah had no idea how to explain this situation to her. Would she understand? Would she be afraid of the man who had been saved by her mother? Victor sat on the worn couch, still processing everything that had happened. He was silent for a long while, staring out the small window, his mind racing. He had been saved by a woman who had no reason to care about him, and for the first time in his life, he found himself questioning everything. He had spent years building his empire on fear and respect, and now, in the blink of an eye, a stranger had saved him without hesitation. Victor had always believed that only power and wealth mattered, but here he was, at the mercy of a nurse with a heart full of compassion. He didn't know what to make of it. As the evening sun began to set, casting a soft orange glow through the trees, Sarah heard the sound of footsteps approaching. Emily's voice carried through the air, calling out to her mother as she approached the cabin. Sarah took a deep breath and stood up, smoothing her shirt as she went to greet her daughter. "Emily," Her 8-year-old daughter was full of energy as she bounced into the room, her wide eyes full of excitement. She had been at a neighbor's house after school and hadn't known about the events of the afternoon. "Mom, I'm home." Emily's voice was cheerful, but it faltered when she saw Victor sitting on the couch. His presence seemed out of place in the small cabin. Sarah crouched down to Emily's level and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Sweetheart, I need to explain something to you." Emily looked up at her mother, sensing the seriousness in her tone. "What's going on, Mom?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. Sarah hesitated for a moment before speaking. "This is Victor," she said softly. He's someone I helped today." Emily's eyes widened as she glanced at Victor. "You helped him?" she asked, her voice filled with innocence and confusion. "Yes," Sarah replied, looking at Victor with a sense of uncertainty. "He was in danger, and I couldn't just leave him there." Victor met Emily's gaze, his expression unreadable. He didn't know how to react to the child who was standing before him, so full of innocence and curiosity. In his world, children were often overlooked or seen as tools in a game he had no interest in. But there was something about Emily's unassuming gaze that caught him off guard. He hadn't expected to find himself in a place like this, a place where there was no power, no control, just a simple family trying to survive. "Thank you, Mom," Emily said quietly, breaking the silence. "You saved him." Sarah's heart softened at her daughter's words, but there was still a lingering unease in her chest. She wasn't sure if she had done the right thing. She had acted on instinct, but now the reality of the situation felt much heavier. She was a mother, responsible for her child's safety, and here she was, sheltering a man who could bring nothing but danger into their lives. Victor could sense Sarah's discomfort, and it made him uneasy. He had never been the kind of man who needed saving, but there was something about this woman and her daughter that made him reconsider his own beliefs. It was strange to him, this feeling of vulnerability. He wasn't used to it. He had spent so many years in control, manipulating people, and now he found himself at the mercy of a woman with no agenda other than kindness. For a brief moment, he wondered if this was the kind of life he had been missing. But no, he couldn't afford to get soft. He couldn't let himself forget who he was. "You're welcome, Emily," Sarah said, snapping herself out of her thoughts. "But we need to talk about what happens next." She looked back at Victor, her gaze filled with concern. "Victor, I don't know what you plan to do now, but I can't keep you here forever." Victor stood up slowly, his tall frame casting a shadow over the small cabin. He had been trapped for so long in a world of darkness, of violence, but he felt something stir inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. It was the desire to change, to do something different. But the reality of who he was, the Mafia boss who had built his empire on fear, was not easily shaken. "I understand," Victor said, his voice steady. "I don't expect you to shelter me forever. But for now, I'm in your debt, and I won't forget it." There was a long silence as Sarah processed his words. She didn't know what to make of his promise. She wasn't sure what it meant, but she knew that her life had already changed in ways she couldn't undo. What she didn't know was that saving Victor Maloney would lead to something far greater than she could have ever imagined, and the choices she made from here on out would affect not just her life, but her daughter's as well. Sarah and Victor sat in the small, dimly lit cabin, the weight of the past few hours settling heavily between them. Sarah glanced over at her daughter, Emily, who was busy coloring in her notebook, seemingly oblivious to the tension in the air. Victor had been silent for most of the evening, the events of the day still lingering in his mind. He was used to control, to being the one who called the shots, but today had been different. He had been saved by a woman who had no reason to care about him, and the realization was unsettling. Sarah had helped him when no one else would have, and now he was left wondering what he owed her. Was it just gratitude, or was there something more at play here? As the night grew colder, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, not just in Victor, but in herself as well. She had always been focused on providing for Emily, keeping her safe, and doing what she could to help others. But saving a Mafia boss, someone as dangerous as Victor, had opened her eyes to a world she had no desire to be part of. Yet, here she was, tangled in it, with no clear way out. Victor finally spoke, his voice low and contemplative. "You don't know what you've done, do you?" he asked, looking directly at her. Sarah hesitated before answering. "I did what anyone would do. I couldn't just stand there and watch you die." Victor chuckled softly, but there was no humor in it. "You're right," he said. "Most people would have turned away. But you didn't. And now, I owe you." Sarah shifted uncomfortably. "You don't owe me anything," she replied, her voice steady. "I only did what was right." But even as she said the words, she knew they weren't entirely true. She had acted on instinct, but now she felt the weight of her actions pressing down on her. "We'll figure this out," Sarah said, trying to push the thoughts aside. "But first, I need to know what happens next." Victor looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I don't know," he admitted. "I wasn't expecting to be in this situation. But I'm not someone who backs down." He paused, as if considering something. "Maybe it's time I change things up." Sarah furrowed her brow. "What do you mean by that?" Victor met her gaze. "You saved me. That means something." Sarah shook her head. "I didn't save you for any reward. I did it because it was the right thing to do." Victor's eyes softened for a moment, and then he stood up, his tall frame casting a shadow across the small room. "I can't promise you anything," he said, his voice firm. "But I will make sure you and Emily are safe. I don't forget those who helped me." Sarah wasn't sure whether to be relieved or concerned. She didn't want to be tangled up in his world, but she also knew that she couldn't turn her back on him now. She had made a choice, and that choice had led her to this moment. The sound of footsteps approaching interrupted her thoughts, and she turned to see Emily standing in the doorway. "Mom, who is this man?" she asked, her voice innocent but full of curiosity. Sarah smiled softly and knelt down to her daughter's level. "This is Victor," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. "He's someone I helped today." Emily's eyes widened. "You helped him?" she asked, glancing back at Victor. Sarah nodded. "Yes, sweetheart. I helped him." Victor looked at Emily, his expression softening slightly. "Thank you for letting me stay," he said quietly. Emily tilted her head, still unsure. "Are you going to hurt us?" she asked innocently, her voice filled with the kind of raw honesty only a child could have. Victor was taken aback by the question. No one had ever spoken to him like that before. "No," he said after a moment, his voice steady. "I'm not going to hurt you." Sarah felt a pang of guilt as she watched the exchange. She had made a choice, but that didn't mean she wasn't worried about the consequences. She didn't want Emily to be caught up in a world of danger. But she also knew that she couldn't ignore the promise she had made to help Victor. For now, they were safe. But Sarah knew that would not last forever. As the night wore on, Sarah couldn't help but think about the future. She had saved Victor Maloney, but what did that mean for her and Emily? Would they ever be able to return to their quiet, simple life? Or had this moment irrevocably altered their path? She didn't know the answers, but she knew one thing for certain. Things would never be the same again. The following days were a blur of uncertainty and caution. Victor Maloney had stayed hidden in the cabin, a man who had once ruled with power and fear now confined to the shadows. Sarah could feel the weight of his presence even when he said nothing. He was a constant reminder of the dangerous world she had unknowingly stepped into. Her life had changed in ways she could never have predicted, and now she found herself wondering if she had made the right choice. The door creaked open one morning, and Emily entered the small living room, her face bright with excitement. "Mom, guess what? I made a new friend at school," she said, her voice full of innocence and joy. Sarah smiled as she watched her daughter, but her thoughts were far from the simple joys of childhood. She glanced over at Victor, who was sitting by the window, staring out into the vast emptiness of the woods. "That's great, sweetheart," Sarah said, her voice soft. "But remember, we need to stay safe. You can't talk to strangers about things we don't want anyone to know." Emily nodded but seemed puzzled. "Why, Mom?" she asked, her brow furrowing. Sarah hesitated, trying to find the right words. "Because sometimes, people are dangerous. Not everyone you meet has good intentions." Her words hung in the air, heavier than she meant them to be. She hated that she had to explain such things to Emily at her age, but the reality of their situation was impossible to ignore. As the days passed, Victor began to talk more, though his words were always measured and cautious. He wasn't used to being in a position where he needed help, but there was something about Sarah's quiet strength that made him rethink everything. He had always believed that power came from controlling others, but here was a woman who had no fear of him, who didn't flinch when he looked at her. It confused him. The last few nights, he had stayed awake, listening to the sound of the wind howling through the trees outside, thinking about what Sarah had said. He owed her, but the debt wasn't just for saving his life. It was something deeper, something he wasn't ready to admit. He had always lived by a code that said trust was a weakness. But Sarah's quiet sacrifice, her willingness to risk everything for him, had shaken something inside him. The world he had built, the empire of crime and power, had never felt so empty. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something more than money or control. The door creaked again, this time more softly. Sarah entered the room, her face tired but determined. She looked at him with a hint of suspicion. "Victor," she began, her voice steady, "I need to know more. About you. About who you are and why you're here." Victor met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "You've seen enough to know who I am," he replied. "I don't need to tell you more." Sarah crossed her arms, her stance firm. "I'm not asking because I'm curious. I'm asking because you can't stay here forever. We need to figure out what comes next." There was a long silence between them. Victor's eyes softened slightly. "What do you want me to say?" he asked quietly. Sarah sat down across from him, her gaze unwavering. "I want you to be honest," she said. "Not with me. With yourself. You're not the same man you were before I saved you. Something's changed." Victor's eyes flickered with something, a hint of vulnerability that he quickly buried. "I'm not used to being in debt to anyone," he admitted, his voice low. "But I won't lie. You saved me, and I don't know what I'm supposed to do about it." Sarah nodded slowly. "That's a start." She stood up, her mind already racing with what she needed to do. "Next, I'm going to make some calls. We'll figure out what's next for you. But I need you to stay hidden for a while longer." Victor watched her, a strange sense of respect building inside him. He had never met anyone like her before. Someone who was willing to put themselves at risk for a stranger. Someone who had no reason to help him, but still chose to. As Sarah stepped toward the door, she paused and looked back at him. "Victor, whatever happens next, I need you to understand something. I didn't help you because I wanted something in return. I helped you because I believe people can change." Victor's eyes met hers, and for the first time in a long while, he wasn't sure if he could change. But something inside him, something he couldn't quite name, wanted to believe that he could. He nodded, a silent agreement passing between them. "I'll stay out of sight," he said. "For now." Sarah smiled, a brief, soft smile. "That's all I ask." And with that, she walked out of the room, leaving Victor alone with his thoughts. Alone, yet not entirely. He had been saved, yes, but now he had a new kind of battle to face, the battle within himself. The days passed quietly after Sarah's confrontation with Victor. Life returned to its routine, but something had changed. There was a tension that lingered in the air, a silent understanding that things would never be the same again. Sarah tried to push it aside, focusing on Emily's schoolwork, their bills, and the daily chores that filled their small, humble home. But Victor's presence hung over them like a shadow. She didn't know what he wanted or what he expected of her. She had saved him, yes, but that didn't mean she understood the consequences. Victor, for his part, remained mostly silent, staying within the confines of the cabin, only speaking when necessary. He spent most of his days pacing the small room, his mind racing. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt this out of control. His world had always been one of dominance and power, but now, for the first time in his life, he felt vulnerable. The Mafia boss who had once ruled over empires, who had taken what he wanted without question, was now living in the shadows, dependent on a woman he barely knew. It was humiliating. But even as he battled with the shame of his situation, a part of him couldn't help but feel gratitude. No one had ever acted like Sarah. No one had ever cared enough to put their own safety at risk for his. It was unsettling, but also human. One morning, as Sarah was preparing breakfast, Victor spoke up. "I need to leave," he said, his voice steady but resolute. Sarah stopped what she was doing, her eyes narrowing in concern. "Leave? Where would you go?" she asked, trying to keep her voice calm. "I can't stay here forever," Victor replied. "You've done enough for me, but I can't be a burden. I need to get back to my world." Sarah's heart sank at his words. She knew this day would come, but she wasn't ready. She had seen something in Victor, something beyond the Mafia boss, beyond the ruthless man he had been. She had seen the cracks in his armor, the vulnerability that no one else had ever seen. And now, he was willing to walk away. "Victor, you can't go back to that world," Sarah said softly. "It's dangerous." You'll be putting yourself and everyone around you at risk. Victor looked at her, his eyes cold but filled with something deeper, something that lingered beneath the surface. I don't have a choice, he said. I've built an empire on fear, and I can't just walk away from it. Sarah knew he was right. His world was one of power, violence, and danger. But she also knew there had to be another way. You don't have to go back, she said, her voice firm. There's more to life than power, Victor. I know you've spent your whole life thinking that it's the only thing that matters, but it's not. Victor stared at her, his expression unreadable. What do you mean? He asked, genuinely confused. I'm not asking you to give up everything, Sarah said. But you've seen what happens when people live for power alone. It destroys them. I've seen it in my work. People who have everything and still end up alone, broken. Victor took a deep breath, his mind whirling. He had never thought of it that way. In his world, power was everything. It was how he survived, how he controlled others. But here, with Sarah, he was starting to see that there was more to life than control. He had always been the one to call the shots, but now, for the first time, he was listening. Maybe you're right, he said quietly. Sarah gave him a soft smile, her eyes filled with understanding. I don't know what the future holds for you, Victor, she said. But I do know that you don't have to go back to that life. You have a choice. For the first time in years, Victor felt a flicker of hope. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there. He had been saved by a woman with nothing to gain, a woman who had seen him as more than just a mafia boss. She had seen him as a person, and that had made all the difference. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. For everything. Sarah nodded, her gaze softening. Just promise me one thing, she said. That you'll think carefully about what you want. You can't go back to that world, but you don't have to stay here either. You have a chance to make a choice. Victor looked at her, his eyes filled with something he hadn't felt in years, uncertainty. He had always been in control, always the one with the power. But now, as he stood in front of Sarah, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he could make a different choice. I will, he said finally. I'll figure it out. Sarah smiled, relieved that he was starting to understand. That's all I can ask. And with that, the two of them sat in silence, the weight of the moment hanging in the air. The world outside was still full of danger and uncertainty, but for the first time, Victor felt like he had a chance at something more, something beyond power. The days following the confrontation between Sarah and Victor had been filled with uneasy silence. As Sarah tried to return to her daily routine, she couldn't shake the feeling that things had shifted, and not just for her, but for Victor too. He had been quieter than usual, his movements slower, his gaze often distant as if lost in thought. It had been 2 weeks since she saved him, and despite the tension, she could sense something different about him. He was no longer the same man who had been tied to the train tracks, at the mercy of a speeding train and his enemies. Victor had always been a man of control, but now, after being saved by Sarah's compassion, he was grappling with something he hadn't experienced in years, vulnerability. Sarah had given him a chance at redemption, but could he take it? Could he let go of the empire of power and fear he had spent his entire life building? One morning, Sarah found herself standing at the window, staring out at the woods as the sun began to rise. She could feel the weight of the decision that lay ahead. Could she really help Victor leave behind the life he knew? Or would his past drag him back into the dangerous world that had nearly destroyed him? She knew the risks. She had seen firsthand what Victor's world was capable of, and she didn't want her daughter, Emily, to be a part of it. The sound of footsteps behind her broke her thoughts, and she turned to find Victor standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. You wanted to talk? He asked, his voice calm, but lacking the usual sharpness that once defined him. Sarah nodded slowly, turning to face him. I've been thinking, she began, her voice steady but filled with the weight of the question that had been on her mind for days. About what comes next for you. Victor raised an eyebrow, his interest piqued but still guarded. You think you know what's next? He asked, his tone a mix of curiosity and caution. Sarah shook her head. No, but I think we need to figure it out together. She took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. You've been given a second chance, Victor. But I don't know if that means you can just walk away from everything you've built. Your past, it's not something you can escape so easily. Victor's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. You're right, he finally said, his voice low. I've spent my whole life building something. Something I thought I could control. But lately I don't know if it's worth it anymore. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She had never heard him speak like this before. Victor Maloney, the Mafia boss who had ruled with an iron fist, was questioning everything. I don't know what to do with myself, he continued, his gaze dropping to the floor. Everything I've ever known is built on fear, power, manipulation. I'm not even sure who I am without it. Sarah took a step forward, her voice softening. You're not the man you used to be, Victor. You don't have to keep pretending. There was a long pause as Victor processed her words. Maybe I don't want to, he finally admitted. But it's hard to let go of something that's been my whole life. Sarah nodded, understanding the internal struggle he was facing. I know, but maybe it's time to start over. You don't have to do it alone. You have a choice, Victor. Victor looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of uncertainty and something deeper, hope. Do you really think I can change? He asked quietly. Sarah didn't hesitate. I think everyone has the ability to change, but you have to want it. Victor stood in silence for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. Then, slowly he nodded. I don't know how to start, but I'll try. Sarah smiled softly, relieved that he was willing to take that first step. That's all I'm asking for. You don't have to have all the answers right now. Just take it one day at a time. The door creaked open, and Emily stepped into the room, her curious gaze flicking between the two adults. Mom, are we going somewhere? She asked, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. Sarah's smile widened, and she crouched down to her daughter's level. We're going to be okay, sweetheart, she said, brushing a stray lock of hair from Emily's face. We're going to start fresh. Together. Emily's eyes lit up, and she hugged Sarah tightly. I'm glad, Mom. I'm glad you're happy. Sarah's heart swelled with love for her daughter, but she knew that happiness would take time. It would be a journey, one filled with challenges and hard choices. But she was ready to face it, and so was Victor. For the first time in a long while, Victor felt something he hadn't known in years, a sense of purpose. The past was still a shadow, but he was beginning to see that the future didn't have to be defined by it. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of the darkness he had lived in for so long. He wasn't sure what that future would look like, but he was willing to find out. Together, they would take the first step. The days following Sarah's conversation with Victor were filled with a quiet tension. They were trying to adjust to their new reality, but it wasn't easy. The past they had lived through, their separate lives, still loomed over them, casting long shadows. Sarah couldn't help but feel the weight of their situation, even as she tried to remain optimistic. Victor had agreed to change, to take a different path, but she knew it wouldn't be simple. Change never was. It was late afternoon when Victor finally spoke again. He had spent most of his time at the cabin keeping to himself, but today he was pacing near the window, staring out at the trees. Sarah, he called softly, not turning to look at her. I've been thinking. Sarah looked up from the kitchen counter where she had been preparing dinner. She wiped her hands on a towel before walking over to him. About what? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady, though a sense of unease stirred inside her. About what I need to do next. Victor's voice was low, filled with a quiet determination. I can't keep hiding here forever. I know I said I wanted to change, but I also know that people won't just forget who I am. Sarah stepped closer, her eyes soft with concern. I don't think you can just erase the past, Victor. But I do think you can make a choice. A different choice. He turned to face her then, his expression intense, but there was something in his eyes that softened, something vulnerable. I've been given a second chance, haven't I? He asked. Sarah nodded slowly. Yes, but what you do with it is up to you. Victor looked out the window again, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. I know what I've built, Sarah, he said. I know the world I've created and the power I've had, but none of it feels real anymore. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. This was the first time she had heard him speak so honestly about his life. It was raw, unguarded. I don't want to be that man anymore, he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. But what if it's too late? What if people like me don't get second chances? Sarah reached out, placing a hand on his arm gently. It's never too late. You don't have to keep running. And you don't have to face this alone. Victor's eyes softened at her touch, but there was still a hint of fear in his gaze. And what about you? What about Emily? He asked, his voice thick with concern. I don't want to drag you into this. Sarah shook her head, her expression firm. You're not dragging me into anything, Victor. You're making a choice. And I'm here to support you. The silence between them was heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a quiet understanding that lingered in the air. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting a soft golden glow over the trees. Sarah's thoughts turned to Emily, and she wondered how much longer they could stay hidden. They couldn't live like this forever. But for now, there was something important about this moment. I think you need to face your past, Sarah said, breaking the silence. You need to take responsibility for what you've done, but you also need to build something new, something you can be proud of. Victor's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. And if I can't, he asked, his voice barely audible. Sarah stepped closer, meeting his gaze. Then you'll find a way. You've already taken the first step. Victor was quiet for a moment, his mind racing with possibilities. Then, slowly he nodded. I'm not sure where to start, he admitted, but I'm willing to try. Sarah smiled softly, relieved that he was finally willing to take that step. That's all I'm asking for, she said. One step at a time. Later that evening, as they sat down to eat, Emily joined them at the table, her eyes bright with curiosity. Mom, what's going to happen next? She asked, her innocent voice cutting through the quiet. Sarah smiled and took a deep breath. I don't know, sweetheart, but we're going to be okay. We're going to make it through this together. Emily smiled back, her trust in her mother unwavering. She didn't understand the complexities of their situation, but she knew one thing. Her family was together. And that was enough. Victor looked at them both, his heart heavy with the weight of the promise he had made to himself. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that he couldn't go back to the life he had left behind. There was no turning back now, only forward. And with Sarah and Emily by his side, he felt a glimmer of hope, something he hadn't felt in a long time. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in years, Victor was willing to face it head-on. The days had passed since Victor's decision to change, and Sarah watched him carefully, trying to see if his resolve would hold. Every conversation they had was full of small steps toward understanding, but the past hung heavily over them all. Emily continued to live in her innocent bubble, unaware of the tension that clouded the house. But Sarah could sense it. Victor was fighting something inside himself. His old world called to him in ways he couldn't ignore, and even though he had promised to change, there was no escaping the reality of the life he had once lived. The Mafia wasn't just an occupation, it was a part of his identity. One afternoon, after a long day of helping Emily with her homework, Sarah found herself standing by the window again, staring into the distance. Victor had been quiet all day, his usual presence now more like a shadow, silent and distant. His old life had a grip on him, and she knew he needed more than just words to break free. He needed action. She turned around to find him standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. We need to talk, he said, his voice steady but strained. Sarah's heart skipped a beat, unsure of what was coming next. She nodded, bracing herself for what he might say. What is it? She asked, her voice gentle but firm. Victor walked into the room, his footsteps heavy on the wooden floor. He stopped in front of her, his eyes filled with a mixture of frustration and determination. I can't keep doing this, he said, his voice low. I can't keep hiding, pretending that I'm someone I'm not. Sarah's heart tightened, but she didn't speak. She simply waited, letting him continue. I've been a part of this world for so long, Sarah. It's all I know. I built it, I ruled it, and now it feels like a lifetime ago. But that world doesn't let you go so easily. He looked at her, his eyes filled with something he hadn't shown her before, fear. I've tried, but every time I think I'm free, it pulls me back. Sarah took a step forward, her voice soft. Victor, you don't have to go back. You don't have to let that world control you anymore. Victor shook his head, frustration building in his chest. It's not that simple, he said, his voice breaking slightly. I've made enemies who won't let me walk away. They'll come for me. And if they come for me, they'll come for you, and Emily too. Sarah's heart skipped a beat at the mention of Emily's name, but she refused to show fear. She had made her choice when she decided to help him. Now, they had to face the consequences together. We'll deal with it, she said, her voice steady. I won't let them hurt you, or us. You've made the choice to change. You've already taken the hardest step. Now we face it together. Victor looked at her, disbelief in his eyes. Together, he repeated, his voice tinged with wonder. You're willing to face this with me? After everything. Sarah nodded slowly, a small smile on her lips. You saved my life, Victor. We'll figure this out. Together. The words were simple, but the promise behind them was enough to break through the wall Victor had built around himself. He took a deep breath, his gaze softening. I don't know what I would have done without you, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah placed a hand on his arm, her grip firm but gentle. You don't have to know. You're here now, and that's what matters. The door creaked open, and Emily's voice called from the other room. Mom, who's coming for dinner? Sarah looked at Victor, her eyes full of quiet resolve. We're facing this together, she repeated, more to herself than to him. And that means we stand together as a family. Victor nodded slowly, finally beginning to understand the weight of her words. A family, he whispered to himself. For the first time, the word didn't feel like a lie. It felt real. As the evening wore on, Sarah and Victor sat down to dinner with Emily, the quiet between them no longer filled with tension, but with a sense of shared purpose. The future was uncertain, and the threats Victor faced were very real. But for the first time, he didn't feel entirely alone. As they ate, Sarah watched Victor carefully, noticing the way he interacted. With Emily, the way he seemed to be trying to change in small ways. She knew it wouldn't be easy, and the road ahead would be filled with challenges. But she also knew something else. Victor was trying. And for now, that was enough. The morning after their conversation, the atmosphere in the cabin was heavy. Sarah had woken up early, making breakfast as usual, but her thoughts were clouded. She was relieved that Victor had decided to face his past, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part was still ahead. How would they protect themselves from the people who would surely come after Victor once they learned he was still alive? She looked over at Victor, sitting at the table, his eyes scanning the newspaper. He had been more withdrawn than usual, clearly lost in thought. For the first time since he had arrived, Sarah noticed how much his past still weighed on him. It wasn't just about leaving the Mafia behind. It was about what he had built and what he had lost. What's going on in your head? Sarah asked, her voice gentle as she set a cup of coffee in front of him. Victor glanced up at her, his expression unreadable. I don't know what to do with all of this, he admitted. I've never had a choice like this before. My entire life has been about control. But now, he trailed off, unable to finish his sentence. Sarah sat down across from him, her gaze soft but steady. You're trying to figure out who you really are without all of that control, she said. Victor nodded slowly. Yeah, and it's harder than I thought. The words hung between them, thick with meaning. Victor had been defined by power and fear for so long that the idea of living any other way seemed foreign to him. But in the weeks since Sarah had saved him, he had started to see the cracks in his own foundation. He wasn't the same man who had been bound to those train tracks, but he also wasn't sure who he was becoming. Sarah reached across the table, placing a hand gently on his. You don't have to have all the answers now, she said quietly. You've already made the hardest decision. Now it's just about taking the next step, one day at a time. Victor looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of appreciation and uncertainty. I'm not used to relying on anyone. I don't know if I'm strong enough to change. Sarah smiled softly, her eyes full of warmth. You don't have to do it alone. You've already proven you're strong enough by staying here, by choosing to face this. The words seemed to settle with Victor, though he still felt the weight of his past pulling at him. As they sat in the quiet of the cabin, Sarah felt a strange sense of calm. They had come a long way since that fateful day when she had saved Victor from the train tracks. But she knew they had a long road ahead of them. It was then that the sound of a car engine broke the silence. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she stood up, her eyes darting toward the window. The car slowed down outside, and her stomach churned. Was this it? Were they about to be found? Victor, sensing her tension, stood up as well, moving toward the window. Who is it? Sarah whispered, her voice tense. Victor didn't answer right away, his eyes narrowing as he tried to make out the car's details. The vehicle came to a stop, and the engine shut off. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. I don't know, she said, her voice shaky. But it's not safe. Victor walked over to her, his presence calm but protective. Stay here, he said, his voice firm. I'll handle it. Sarah wanted to argue, to tell him that she didn't want him to face whatever threat this was alone, but she stayed silent. She knew Victor was right. This was his fight, and she couldn't protect him from everything. They had to face this together. The door creaked open, and Sarah's heart raced as Victor stepped outside, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. She watched from the window, her eyes wide with worry. She could barely see the figure approaching the cabin, but the tension in the air was palpable. Victor's voice reached her ears, calm and commanding. "What do you want?" The response was muffled, but Sarah could see the stranger gesturing toward Victor, speaking in low tones. It was a moment of uncertainty, a moment where the future of their fragile peace hung in the balance. Sarah felt her pulse quicken, her instincts screaming at her to be ready. But she stayed where she was, watching from the window. She could only hope that this wasn't the end of their brief escape from the danger that had followed Victor for so long. The stranger seemed to leave after a few moments, and Victor stepped back inside, his expression unreadable. He walked toward Sarah, his shoulders tense. "It's one of my old associates," he said, his voice calm but firm. "He came to check on me. I told him to leave." Sarah nodded, relief washing over her, but she couldn't shake the fear that still lingered in her chest. "Are we safe?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Victor met her gaze, his eyes dark but resolute. "For now," he said, his voice low. "But we need to leave. They're not going to stop looking for me." The truth hung in the air like a heavy weight. They couldn't stay here forever. Victor's past had caught up with them, and they were running out of time. The tension in the cabin had only grown since Victor's warning that they couldn't stay hidden forever. Sarah had tried to keep things normal, focusing on Emily's schoolwork and the household chores, but every day felt like they were walking on borrowed time. Each car that passed by, each shadow in the trees, sent a fresh wave of anxiety coursing through her. The weight of Victor's past was a constant reminder of what they were up against. He had made it clear that the associates he had left behind wouldn't rest until they found him. And it wasn't just him they would come after. His new life, his new family, would be in danger too. They had no choice but to leave. "We can't stay here anymore," Victor said one evening as they sat at the table. His voice was firm, but there was something more in his eyes now, something softer. Sarah looked at him, her heart heavy with the knowledge of what this meant. She had been expecting this, but that didn't make it any easier. "Where will we go?" she asked, her voice small. "We need to get out of the area. There are places I can go, places where they won't find us so easily." Victor's words were resolute, but Sarah could see the uncertainty behind them. He wasn't used to relying on anyone else, let alone asking for help. He was a man used to being in control, used to being feared. But now, for the first time, Sarah could see how much his world had crumbled. The empire he had built was now nothing but ruins, and the people who once worked for him were the same ones who would see him dead. "I don't want to go back to that life," he said quietly, almost as if he was speaking to himself. Sarah reached across the table, placing a hand over his. "You don't have to," she said softly. "We'll figure it out together. You don't have to be alone in this." Victor looked at her, his eyes searching her face, as if he were trying to understand how she could still care after everything. "But you don't understand," he whispered. "They'll come for us. You're not safe with me. You and Emily. You deserve a life without fear." The words stung, and Sarah's heart clenched. But she wasn't going to let him push her away. "I've made my choice," she said firmly. "I'm here because I want to be. We'll face this together. I'm not leaving you." For the first time since that fateful day when he had been tied to the tracks, Victor felt something shift within him. It was the first time he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't beyond saving. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to fight this alone. The next few days were spent in a whirlwind of preparations. Sarah packed what they could carry, while Victor made the necessary arrangements to leave town. He had a few contacts left, people who might help them disappear, but there was still a lingering danger. If anyone knew he was alive, the risk would be too great. The sun had barely begun to set when they finally loaded up the old car Sarah had been using to run errands. The sound of the engine starting felt final, as if it was the beginning of the end, but also the start of something new. Victor sat in the front seat beside her, his jaw clenched, eyes on the road ahead. Emily, sitting in the back, was quieter than usual, sensing the gravity of the moment. "We'll be okay, Mom?" she asked softly. Sarah glanced at her daughter. In the rearview mirror, her heart breaking at the innocence in her voice. "We'll be okay, sweetheart," she promised, even though she wasn't sure. The drive felt endless. The world outside seemed to blur as Sarah focused on the road, her thoughts consumed with worry about what lay ahead. Victor's silence beside her was a constant reminder of the weight they were carrying, both physically and emotionally. They were leaving behind everything they knew, stepping into an uncertain future, but they had no choice. As the night deepened, they reached a small town just beyond the border. It was quiet here, the kind of place where no one would look for them. They pulled into a dilapidated motel, tucked away from the main road. It wasn't much, but it would do for now. Sarah turned off the engine, and for a moment, they all sat in the car, not moving. "This is it," Victor said quietly, his voice breaking the silence. "This is the start." Sarah nodded, her hand resting on the door handle. "It's just the beginning, Victor. We'll make it work." But as they stepped out of the car, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that their journey was far from over. They were safe, for now, but danger was never far behind. The life they had left behind would always be there, just waiting for the right moment to catch up with them. But for tonight, they had peace. And for the first time, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could build a new life. A life where they didn't have to look over their shoulders. A life where they could be free. The days after their arrival at the small motel felt like a strange limbo. Sarah, Victor, and Emily had managed to leave behind the familiar dangers of the city, but Sarah knew that their temporary safety was fragile. The life they had once known, Victor's life of control, wealth, and power, still loomed in the shadows, and the question of how long they could remain hidden lingered in the back of her mind. Every knock at the door, every passing car, every unfamiliar face on the street made Sarah's heart race. She had promised Emily that everything would be okay, but she couldn't help but wonder if they were truly safe. It was late one evening when the unsettling sound of a knock on the motel door sent Sarah's pulse racing. She glanced at Victor, who had been sitting by the small window, his gaze constantly scanning the surroundings. His eyes met hers, filled with the same unease she was feeling. They had both known this moment would come, the moment when the past would catch up with them. Victor stood up slowly, his face set in a mask of calm, though Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders. "Stay here," he said, his voice low and firm. Sarah didn't argue. She knew that Victor had lived through far worse situations than this. She stayed close to Emily, trying to keep the fear out of her voice. "It's okay, sweetheart. Just stay close to me." Emily nodded, sensing the change in the atmosphere, but trusting her mother's calmness. Victor opened the door just a crack, and Sarah strained to hear the conversation from the other room. For a moment, there was silence. Then, Victor's voice broke through, his tone cold but controlled. "I told you to stay away," he said. Sarah's heart skipped a beat at the harshness in his voice. She couldn't tell who was on the other side of the door, but she could sense the threat in the air. She stood up slowly, walking toward the door, her eyes flicking to Emily, who was still holding tightly to her. The conversation on the other side of the door became more intense. Victor's voice raised slightly. "You know what will happen if you don't leave," he warned. The response was muffled, but Sarah could hear the edge of hostility in the other person's voice. "You're not in control anymore, Victor. It's over." Sarah's heart sank. The past was catching up with them, just as she had feared. Victor had always been a man who controlled everything around him, but now he was vulnerable, hiding with a woman and child who had nothing to do with his world. She held her breath, waiting for what would come next. Then, the door opened fully, and Sarah stepped into the doorway, her gaze focused on the stranger standing there. A tall man, dressed in black, his expression cold and unflinching. Sarah's pulse quickened, but she didn't show any fear. She had already made a promise to herself. She would protect Emily no matter what. The man's eyes flicked over to her, and then back to Victor. "She's not part of this," Victor said, his voice steady but with a dangerous edge. The man ignored him, his gaze now fixed on Sarah. "Is that so?" he asked, his tone mocking. "You think you can just walk away from all of this?" Sarah took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. "We've walked away," she said firmly. "You don't have to bring us into this." The man didn't move, his stance still threatening. "I don't have time for your games," he said, his voice growing colder. "This isn't over, Victor. You can't hide forever." With a final, calculating look, the man turned and left without another word. Sarah stood frozen for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. The door closed softly behind him, and she could feel the weight of the situation settling in. Victor stepped back from the door, his eyes haunted. "He's one of my old associates," he said, his voice tight. He's right. I can't hide forever. Sarah's heart ached as she looked at him. She had hoped they would have more time, that they could settle into a new life and forget the dangers of his past. But now, it was clear that the price of Victor's choices was catching up with them. What now? She asked quietly, the fear in her voice barely masked. Victor met her gaze, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and resolve. I don't know, he admitted. But I know I can't run anymore. I've got to face this. Sarah nodded slowly, her heart heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. They couldn't outrun the past. The question now was whether they could survive it. As they sat in the quiet of the motel room, Sarah realized that their lives had just shifted again. The danger was real, and it was closing in on them. But for the first time since they arrived, Victor seemed ready to face whatever came next. Together, they would have to find a way out. But Sarah couldn't help but wonder, was it already too late? The days had passed in a blur since the confrontation at the motel. Sarah, Victor, and Emily had moved into a small town, far from the dangers of the city, but the weight of their past was never far behind. The tension in the air was thick with uncertainty, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The past had a way of catching up with you, no matter how far you ran. Victor spent most of his time in silence, deep in thought, while Sarah tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy for Emily's sake. But the truth was, Sarah knew that their quiet life in the small town couldn't last forever. One afternoon, as Sarah was picking up groceries at the local store, she ran into someone unexpected. A man with a sharp, calculating gaze stood at the checkout counter, his eyes scanning the room before locking onto her. Sarah froze for a moment, feeling her heart race. She didn't recognize him, but the way he looked at her sent a chill down her spine. The man smiled, but there was something unsettling about the smile, like he knew too much. Sarah Thompson, I presume, he asked, his voice smooth, almost too smooth. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to think of how to respond. She didn't know who he was, but she could tell he wasn't here for a friendly visit. Who are you? She asked, her voice calm but laced with an undercurrent of fear. The man tilted his head, his smile widening. My name is Mark, he said, taking a step closer to her. I'm an old friend of Victor Maloney. Sarah's blood ran cold at the mention of Victor's name. She knew that this was the moment they had been dreading, the moment the past finally caught up with them. Victor isn't here, she said, her voice steady despite the panic rising in her chest. And he doesn't want anything to do with you. Mark chuckled softly, a sound that made Sarah's skin crawl. Oh, I think Victor and I still have some unfinished business, he said, his eyes narrowing. And you, Sarah, are very much involved. Sarah's stomach dropped as the realization hit her. They had been found. The life they had been trying to escape was now closing in on them, and there was no way out. What do you want? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Victor knows what I want, Mark replied. I just need to make sure you and your daughter stay out of the way. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to think of a way out of this situation. She knew she couldn't let Mark get to Victor, but she also couldn't risk putting Emily in danger. You won't get away with this, she said, her voice filled with determination. Victor will stop you. Mark's smile faded, replaced with a cold, calculating expression. Victor can't stop me, he said, his voice low. He doesn't have the power he once had. Sarah felt a surge of anger, but she knew it wasn't the time for a fight. Where is he? She asked, her voice steady. Mark took a step back, his eyes scanning the room once more. That's for me to know, and for you to find out, he said, before turning and walking out of the store. Sarah stood frozen for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. She had hoped they could escape from the danger, but now she knew that it had always been lurking just around the corner. She quickly paid for her groceries and rushed home, her mind racing with what she had just learned. Victor was in more danger than ever. She needed to warn him, but she didn't know how much time they had left. As she pulled into the driveway of their small house, she saw Victor standing by the window, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Sarah stepped out of the car, her heart heavy with the weight of the truth. Victor, she called softly, we've been found. Victor turned to face her, his expression unreadable. I know, he said, his voice low. I could feel it. I knew they were coming. Sarah's heart sank at his words. She had hoped they could outrun the past, but now she realized that Victor's world was never going to let him go. The danger wasn't over. It was just beginning. What do we do now? She asked, her voice shaking. Victor walked over to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and regret. "We face it head on," he said. "We don't run. We stand and fight." Sarah nodded, a sense of resolve settling in her chest. She had never imagined her life would come to this, to be standing alongside a former Mafia boss, preparing to fight against the past. But as she looked at Victor, she knew that this was the only way forward. They had no other choice. "Together," she whispered, her voice filled with quiet strength. Victor nodded, his gaze steady. Together. The moment stretched between them, and for the first time, Sarah felt the weight of the journey ahead. The past was never far behind, but now, with Victor by her side, she was ready to face whatever came next. Ignite your passion for dark romance with a gripping tale that explores the complexities of love and danger. A Mafia boss, once a man of power and control, is brought to the brink of death only to be saved by a selfless nurse and her daughter. In this thrilling dark romance, the lines between right and wrong blur as they navigate a life filled with suspense, choices, and unforeseen challenges. As the past catches up with them, secrets unfold, and a journey of redemption begins. This dark romance is not just about love. It's about survival, trust, and the pursuit of a second chance. Can love truly conquer a dark past, or will it be consumed by the shadows of betrayal and danger? Follow the captivating twists and turns of this dark romance, where every decision leads them deeper into the unknown. Will they emerge victorious, or will the darkness of their past consume them forever? Dive into this dark romance and experience a story filled with intensity, emotion, and a fight for survival that will leave you breathless.